Now we're ready. 1, 2, 3. Hey, everybody. We are filming a special episode of Chalkboard History. This is like an All in the Family episode with a live studio audience and in a different location because we normally do this at Ripavilla.
Yep.
And tonight we are ensconced in the Fleming Center.
And I don't need to use the soundboard for applause because they can actually clap and applaud.
They can, or
but
throw things.
Clearly they weren't going to do it. They did not take the cue very well.
All right, so tonight's conversation is...
Well, we don't have the chalkboard, but it is the election of 1860.
I thought we were talking about 2024.
I wouldn't touch that one with a 10-foot stick.
Oh, goodness gracious. All right, so the election of 1860.
I mean, we can talk about 2024. I just think there's going to be a fight that breaks out.
When has that ever stopped us? So the election of 1860. We talked the other day about... instead of just dropping everybody into 1860, which, for those of you who might not be, completely clued into everything Civil War, is the election that Abraham Lincoln wins, which sends him to the White House, and soon Civil War spreads across the nation. But we didn't get to that point in time by accident. So let's dial back let's go back about 10 years, and then we'll end up hitting the 1856 election. So in the decade before the Civil War, there is tremendous dissent, and the biggest political, congressional, presidential debate all hinges on slavery. There are certainly conversations about the moral issues of slavery and the legal issues of slavery, but the primary legal slavery conversation is about expansion and whether slavery can continue to spill into the territories. So there's two major political parties. One of them collapses in 1854. The Republican Party is created, and they are almost exclusively an anti-slavery party.
Out of the ashes of the old dominant Whig party.
Right, mostly out of the Whigs, but disaffected even Democrats. There's know-nothings. They all kind of cobble together. And when we say anti-slavery, it's really this anti-slavery in the territories. They're trying to, it's a two-step approach. If they can stop it there, they can deal with the issue where it already exists, but they want to halt it in the territories. Of course, Lincoln emerges very quickly because he gives his Peoria speech in the aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, all of this is like a big, boring civics lesson for a lot of people, but if you lived in that era, this was their world, and they were very aware of these issues, just like we are aware of the issues that are being discussed right now about the 2024 election. It's just different subject matter. This is very real, and people were in tune to this. So
you did say something a second ago that you wanted to jump back 10 years. I mean, just think about 1850 all by itself. It's the year of the compromise, the great compromise of 1850. James McPherson says it is the inauspicious start to the decade. Because from that point forward, it is one thing after another, seemingly all putting us on a course to 1860. Big things, right? So we get the compromise, and then 2 years later, it's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Then 2 years after that, it's Kansas-Nebraska Act. Then 2 years later, 1856, Charles Sumner's beaten on the floor of the House, beaten up in Washington, D.C. by Preston Brooks. And then a year later, it's the Dred Scott decision. And then it's the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And then John Brown launches his raid into Harper's Ferry in 59, and then it's 1860. So if you want a blow-by-blow of the 10 years, there's the social aspect. And then the political is that we've got an election in 56 between this new Republican Party and John C. Fremont, a radical abolitionist, anti-slavery force, and who?
Well, it's Fremont and it's James Buchanan, but this is before Dred Scott. This is before the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This is the last moment when there seems to be any sanity in the country.
Yeah.
And to bring a little flavor of Tennessee in, Tennessee was a state that, even by the time of the war, was very iffy on secession. Tennessee had not voted for a Democrat as president since Andrew Jackson had left.
Right.
So the last time Tennessee had voted for a Democrat was 1832.
Was it just a matter of not being able to get along?
No, it's because it.
Right, you get people who have very different in Tennessee.
No,
yeah.
because the Democrats didn't run Tennessee. The Whigs did. The Democrats were really more of a northern faction and a deep South faction. Tennessee was never part of that. And I think a lot of people even who live in Tennessee probably don't know that. So Democrats lost in Tennessee in 36, in 40, in 44. James K. Polk couldn't win Tennessee. Then they lost in 48, they lost in 52, but the Democrats did one thing in 56. Well, they did two things. They kept John C. Fremont off the ballot.
Yep.
They wouldn't even put him on the ballot in the southern states. Direct voter suppression. Not that Fremont probably would have gotten a lot of northern votes, but not everybody in the South was certainly in line with where the Democrats were headed. But it's the only election between Jackson and the war in which the Democrats not only won Tennessee, but they won Williamson County. Democrats couldn't hold a candle to the Whigs in Williamson County. The Democratic stronghold in this area was Murray County. Yep. So 56 is key because Buchanan wins, but Buchanan's a northern Democrat. He's not even a southern Democrat, and many people thought he'd sold his soul to the slave holders of the South. And then the Supreme Court, barely a year in, issues the Dred Scott decision. Lincoln runs for Senate in 58, and although he lost to Douglas, we've all heard of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And Lincoln lost the election, but he won the argument because they were talking about a national dilemma. And so by the time we get to 1860, it was wild. And you've heard me say, if anybody today listening here or as you watch the video in the days that follow, we are nowhere near as divided today as we were in 1860. I mean, our divisions are paltry and rather juvenile compared to what was happening in 1860, because the two biggest difference between then and now, to be quite plain, there aren't 4 million slaves in this country. And we're also not divided geographically like we were then. There may be red states and blue states, but the divisions are nothing like what they were. And so take us through the conventions. How do we get to a presidential election that is as busted up, split up, and sideways as what happens in 1860?
Well, the Democrats convene, and we know that because we've got John McGavick there. We know how that plays out. They meet first in Charleston, and Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats are intensely divided about slavery. There is a whole faction of the party that even in the convention is already talking about secession.
Well, they walk out.
Then they leave.
One state after, they just walk out of the convention.
Mississippi goes first.
Alabama.
Yeah. But we even see that they go through secession commissioners, 1, 2, 3, and then finally the third guy, I read about him recently, David Todd. Todd says, all right, first rule of me being the commissioner, you can't fire me anymore. Second rule, we're going to keep voting until we come up with a nominee, and they can't even do that.
Right. They go through 3 days.
3 days, 56 or 57?
55 or 56 ballots. And Tennessee was very strongly behind Andrew Johnson. Later they shifted to Stephen Douglas, but they were totally opposed to what Mississippi, Alabama were really pushing. But
then they're pushing John Cable Breckinridge,
and the
vice president, all these things.
Yeah, he's the sitting vice president. Think about this.
Which also, for a second, think about his argument. I'm a fire eater, I want to be the president of the United States, and I want to be able to let the state secede while also presiding over that country. It's the mental gymnastics required.
It's a really remarkable moment when you think that the sitting vice president and the president of the Senate is at a convention and is the leading choice of the states that want to break up the Union. And Breckinridge is his aura is there. South Carolina is pulling all the strings behind the scenes. And the convention collapses, and then, of course, in their infinite wisdom, they have 2 conventions in Baltimore, and they choose 2 candidates. Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge.
And then we have our own party born out of compromise, the Constitutional Union Party, led by John Bell. And Bell, Bell's essentially his platform. The way I like to think of it is, Mr. Bell, what do you think about slavery? Well, I can neither confirm nor deny that I have a platform issue about the institution of slavery. Mr. Bell, what would you do about the expansion of slavery in the territories? I can neither confirm nor deny that there is slavery being expanded in the territories. He seems to have no platform.
Well,
no public platform when it comes to talking about it.
Their platform was, I believe, 2 sentences, and the platform was to retain the balance in the situation as it existed. They didn't
keep the status quo.
They didn't want to take any stand. They wanted it to remain as it was. And as strange as that may seem, it seems like you're really not taking a position. It had huge support. Yeah. There were a lot of people in the country who were very supportive of that.
And not to throw away the ending on it, but he does win the 3 powerhouse states of the South.
Yeah, he wins Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia.
Yeah. If you're going to win in the country, those are the swing states of 1860. You need to have at least 1 or 2 of those 3 states.
But then what happens is the Republicans get together, and the Republicans had learned a lesson from 56. They had learned a lesson internally, but they had learned a lesson externally. And internally was they couldn't be all that principled. They had to win. Mm-hmm. Okay? And they had to forfeit some of their very deeply held beliefs to win, because they had to appeal to more moderate voters. Mm-hmm. They also realized that the Democrats were some of the most self-loathing politicians in the history of the country, and they would easily be divided. Mm-hmm. Because if you could pick the right candidate, the Democrats had already shown they would rip themselves apart and cut their own throats. Mm-hmm. And so the Republicans decided not to nominate William Seward, who was really the leading candidate.
Yeah, he's the voice going into this.
And Seward, to his credit, he is a dedicated abolitionist. Mm-hmm. He did not throw a fit. And for the betterment of the country, he stepped aside. And Lincoln gets the nomination, mm-hmm. and all of a sudden you have a lawyer who has served 1 2-year term in the U.S. House as a Whig, mm-hmm. who has now become the leading voice, not necessarily of the North, but of the Northern man. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He mm-hmm. was not a man from Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. But he knew his people in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio. And he knew 2 things. And he had said this for at least 8 years to that point. Slavery was wrong. He wasn't talking about equality, but he was insistent over and over and over that slavery was wrong. And he also knew that there was great prejudice in the North, but he knew that white men all over the North had been using their own 2 white hands to grow crops, to produce products. Mm. And he saw the slave labor system and the free labor system they were already clashing. Mm-hmm. And this harkens back to his house.
I was going to say, he saw that from his early years with his father.
But it's his house divided speech. He is making a calculated argument that he believes resonates with Northerners, enough Northerners, mm-hmm. that the country could not be divided any longer. Mm-hmm. It had to be one thing or the other. Mm-hmm. Slavery was going to consume the territories, and Dred Scott had already shown that slavery mm-hmm. could leak back into free states. Mm-hmm. So it was going to become one thing or the other. The balance could not continue. Mm-hmm. And that makes him a terrible threat in the South mm-hmm. because he's not an abolitionist. He couldn't be marginalized as a kook. All of a sudden, he's making a different kind of argument, and he's very successful, isn't he?
He wins.
Well, he does, right?
But he's able to prove himself as a moderate, as a Republican in a party full of, I'm going to use the term progressive, not meaning the same thing as we would allude to it today, but in a party of William Seward.
I'm not texting. I'm looking up something.
He's texting. It's fine. It's okay. Was that a picture of John Bell?
Yes, it was.
What a little curmudgeon. He looks... I wish we could get a picture to blow up there. But Lincoln, I think, in a party of Sewards, in a party of Thaddeus Stevens types, Lincoln emerges as a voice that can talk to the more fringe group of his party and drag them along and say, look, if you want, in the end of the day, if you want abolitionists, you got to start somewhere, and you start here with being a moderate. And we have to ride on this all together.
He does, and he does something else which may sound somewhat repetitive. He continues to say, we cannot get equality if we don't end slavery. Mm-hmm. We can't make that leap. I know Northerners are not ready to go there.
Yep.
But they know that there's something wrong with this institution. Mm-hmm. And dare I say, just like some people might be willing to tolerate certain types of abortion, but they know something's wrong with it, if that's what their belief system is. They know inside they can't go all the way, but they know they don't like it. And there was something about the political agitation that had been going on, and Northerners were also being reshaped. The North was being reshaped by immigration. And Lincoln saw this. Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, Germans, Welsh, and Irish had been pouring into the United States.
And working as free labor,
and statistics show over 90% settled in northern states. These people were, the vast majority, despised slavery because they themselves had been such a lower class, they could see there was often not a whit's bit of difference. And Lincoln saw them as well.
It's no surprise we're gonna reference one man, because I think we've both spent a lot of time with a certain Indiana state senator named George Wagner. But Wagner is the prototypical Republican in 1860.
He is.
A man who has worked his entire life in agriculture. He's entered into politics with this idea, maybe not necessarily about slavery, but about the Union, about the way that government should work. So then when Lincoln is elected and he sees the reaction, he speaks, I think, for a lot of Republicans, particularly in the Midwest. And I think that vein, you can trace it to people in Illinois, you can trace it to soldiers who are here. Now you're pulling up maps. You've got electoral votes. Is that what we have?
This ties into like what so Wagner's from the plains of central Indiana.
Yep.
And if you look at what Lincoln pulls off in 1860, so we'll get into like some deeper statistics, which tells you something about the status of the country. But just when you look at states, he wins Maine. He won.
You
Maine.
said statistics, and it started to.
Oh, I love it. It's like a matrix of love. He wins Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, California, and Oregon.
Well, he has to split a portion of New Jersey.
He has to split a portion of New Jersey. But Douglas and Bell take 4 other states.
Yep.
So the secessionist candidate gets all of the states that become part of the Confederacy, with the exception of he also got Maryland. All right? So we all know North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas. Lincoln also understood something else, and this leads into between his election then and inauguration, because an election isn't just about a day. An election is about what happens next.
And talk about the reaction to the election, because we've both seen that Murray County newspaper the day after Lincoln's elected.
Well,
and it ends with saying there's no choice now but war.
Well, the reaction was what had been said since May, is that if Lincoln and the black Republicans won, and that's what they called them, and they, as I've said many times, they didn't call them black Republicans because they wore black suits. Anybody today who says that Lincoln didn't care about slavery or it wasn't really about slavery, well, hell, every Southern newspaper editor thought it was about slavery. It's all they talked about. And they said that if Lincoln and the black Republicans got in, it meant abolition. Yep. And so they'd been pounding this into their people for months. And so the moment the election results...
Years. An anti-slavery
but boy, it goes wild.
Oh, yeah, they ramp it up. The second that Lincoln is a realistic possibility,
and the minute he's elected, you see the movements begin. But Lincoln also knew something else. And this is something that I probably, because I hadn't really looked at a lot of the down and dirty details. The secession movement itself was a minority movement, and a minority movement in a huge way. This was probably less than 20% of the population of the United States, which means it's less than 40% of the population of the entire South was dragging the entire country into this cauldron of fire. If you look at the South, you can see the divisions between the Breckinridge voters and the Douglas voters. John Breckinridge, the secessionist candidate, there's only one. He barely got half of the vote. So who's voting in the South in 1860? White men. Well, he's still only getting half of the white men. That tells you right there that half of the white men in the South did not want to secede.
And Douglas is even pleading election night down in Mobile.
Yeah, he's in Mobile.
Begging for votes.
The loneliest man in the country, trying to get some Southerners
just to listen.
Not to destroy the South.
Yeah.
And so this becomes a numbers game. And Lincoln, to this day, wins an election, the lowest popular vote total in the history of the country for the person who won. It was 39.7% of the vote. But he won in a landslide because he won the states that mattered. And that's how the system works. And in my opinion, that's how it's always been intended to work. And now I can jokingly say at least Southern politicians were sincere and said they would secede. They didn't cry about the election being stolen. They just said they didn't like the results. And I'm being completely serious about that too. They simply said they refused to live under this domination. And so they began to secede. So
then they leave.
Then there's the what next. And here's the thing that happens.
And keep in mind, this is not election December, January inauguration. This is election December, January, February, March.
Inauguration was early March.
March 4th.
So someone asked me not long ago, did the Republican Party and Lincoln actually believe that the southern states would secede? And I think the answer, based on the evidence, is they didn't think they would, because they'd long threatened this. But then they did, and South Carolina left. There is this agonizing few weeks between South Carolina leaving and the next state. And this is where Jefferson Davis, I have to bring in a Jefferson Davis story because he had become the leading voice of secession in the decade before the war. Jefferson Davis had been a senator, who was a senator. Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln did not see the world in the same way. They just didn't see the country in the same way. The entire Mississippi delegation left Washington, D.C. on January 9th. All the congressmen and the other senator, and Davis stayed, almost as if Davis realized that, well, now it was real, right? And now what are we going to do? And I think Davis, in his own way, did love the Union. And he waffles, and he stayed for many days. There's a photograph of him that turned up in recent years. He went down to Matthew Brady's studio, and you can see it on his face. He knows that now they can't back off, and the next state that has to go is going to be Mississippi. And he gives his farewell address in the Senate on January 21st. And by then, several other states have already seceded, and Davis went back and was soon president of the Confederate States. I don't think the Republicans ever thought that it would start, but once it started, they couldn't stop it.
And they were powerless in that moment to do much of anything about it.
They were powerless in that moment, and what many Southern politicians, and probably even Davis, miscalculated was they didn't think that Lincoln would actually stand up. They didn't think that Lincoln would actually stand up and try and stop secession to save the Union. They also gravely underestimated the vast white population of the North's commitment to preserve the Union. They had correctly guessed that most of them really didn't care about slavery per se, but they had miscalculated on the Union, and they had miscalculated because most of them thought about their state first. And I think that's an important point I try to make to people all the time. The vast majority of people in the North didn't think about themselves in a state-centric way, especially the immigrants.
They didn't say they were an Indiana, and they didn't say they were a New Yorker. They said they were
some poor guy from a farm in Denmark didn't get on a boat to go to Pennsylvania He just ended up there. And so they saw the country differently. Sam Houston warned against this. Franklin Pierce warned Jefferson Davis against this. And he would know since he was from New Hampshire. And he said, you don't know the commitment of these northern men to defend this country.
Well, Sherman says that to David Lloyd French
Yes.
when he leaves from Pineville in Louisiana. You underestimate the power of the North.
Right. And so then something else happens. And I think this is Lincoln's, it's one of the early crucible moments for him because he's not yet president. And there's only so much you can do when you're not president, but you do have a lot of leverage because your incoming administration is starting to set a general tone. I think there's ample evidence that Abraham Lincoln made a calculated decision, and he knew that he was going to lose North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And here's why he knew it. Because he couldn't back out of Fort Sumter. And he wasn't going to back out of Fort Sumter because that fort sat on U.S. property. You may have heard people say South Carolina owned it. They didn't. They sold it to the U.S. government 30 years earlier and made the U.S. taxpayers build that fort. That was U.S. government property. That's why Anderson had moved the garrison from the South Carolina coast to that fort. And Lincoln wasn't going to back off, and he knew that Davis would have to fire on that fort, and he knew that those middle slave states were likely going to fold up. So he towed the line on Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and he knew he had to hold them. And as we know, it worked. They did stay because they were very pro-Union. There's an old saying that Kentucky didn't become Southern until after the Civil War, and it's true. It was very pro-Union, as was almost all of Missouri. You
know what I'm going to push you on, right? So one of the things that gets thrown at us, and I would argue largely because of social media, is Crittenden Compromise. Oh, well, Lincoln...
I thought you were going to say Corwin Amendment.
We could do that, too. Do them both.
Well, the Crittenden...
Because the Crittenden Compromise might be the best shot. And it's a desperate shot, but the best shot. No. It's the only option left for John Crittenden.
Well, it was the only option for Crittenden, and the amazing thing about that is that when I say this...
He actually thought that it might work.
When I say this, again, when you look at statistics and you realize how many members of northern states were in the House and in the Senate, especially after some southern representatives had already left, the fact that you proposed an amendment to the Constitution saying slavery could never be abolished.
Right.
I mean, it was never going to pass.
Yeah.
It was like pandering to people who'd already left Congress. And then the Corwin Amendment is a sort of hybrid of that same thing. And Lincoln comes in, and here's a civics lesson, even if you get it through Congress, how many states does it take to ratify an amendment?
You still need the 2/3 vote, right?
3/4.
3/4 vote.
It takes 3/4 of the states. So by the time Lincoln's inaugurated, he's heard about the Corwin Amendment, and Lincoln's like, yeah, go ahead. Using modern vernacular. He's like, go ahead, knock yourself out. I don't have any opposition to it, because he knows there's no way it's ever going to get ratified. Because if you look, there's already 7 states out of the Union.
Yep.
And so that's 27 left. You'd need like 20 states. Oh yeah, good luck getting all the states that Lincoln won to ratify that amendment. So Lincoln just said, go ahead, play around. I'm not playing around. I'm holding the line. And then he's inaugurated. And it's that famous line about secession is the essence of anarchy. And I think it's one of the greatest lines, because what Lincoln, in so many words, was saying, other than the obvious, was that if states could just do this because they could just make up reasons, well, then any state could do it. And then there's no union. Lincoln was also extraordinarily well-versed on the creation of the Constitution and what James Madison had said about nullification 30 years before. And I love spirited debate. Secession's not constitutional. It's just not. And there are people who can say that it is, and it's just not. And Lincoln clearly understood this, and he just stood up and waited for the inevitable to happen, which was Davis had to fire on Fort Sumter.
Can I? March 4th, 1861.
March 4th, 1861.
My countrymen, one and all, think calmly and well upon this whole subject. Nothing valuable can be lost by taking time. If there be an object to hurry any of you in hot haste to a step which you would never take deliberately, that object will be frustrated by taking time. But no good object can be frustrated by it. Such of you now as are now dissatisfied still have the old Constitution unimpaired, and on the sensitive point, the laws of your own framing under it, while the new administration will have no immediate power, if it would, to change either. If it were admitted that you who are dissatisfied hold the right side in the dispute, there is still no single good reason for precipitate action. Intelligence, patriotism, Christianity, and a firm reliance on Him who has never yet forsaken this favored land are still competent to adjust is the best way all of our present difficulty. In your hands, my fellow dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature.
And so he lays down a challenge which he knows will be ignored. Mm-hmm. But he is speaking not just for the moment, but for posterity. Mm-hmm. Because his resolve at that moment was that any conversations about expansion of slavery mm-hmm. or slavery were moot if the Union collapsed. And this was the great miscalculation by, I think, the likes of Jefferson Davis, although he mm-hmm. earnestly believed the states could do it. But Davis and others had frankly been misled by John C. Calhoun's re-architecting of the Constitution. Yep. It's so obvious from reading the letters at the time of the convention and the Federalist Papers. There's this great letter when Alexander Hamilton, who was from New York, wrote to James Madison. This is during the debates about ratification. And New York had always been a problem. You know, they didn't vote for the Declaration. They abstained.
Courteously.
And so there was a letter written, and he asked Madison, could New York have conditional ratification? Essentially, could New York get in and then get out? And Madison's response was conditional ratification would be worse than none at all. The states cede their absolute sovereignty when they join the Union. It's that simple. Those words were intentionally warped years later by Calhoun. And we talk a lot today about the erasing of history. This has been erased from our textbooks, mm-hmm. especially in much of the South, for 160 years. Mm-hmm. And secession has been bantied about like it's just something we can do. And Lincoln took this approach, which I think is grounded not just in constitutional theory, but constitutional law, and the adjudication of almost 75 years of the country's history, that the states can't just do whatever they want. Mm-hmm. That's why there's a supremacy clause. But if enough people, I don't want this to sound like it's a modern comment, but you know, history bleeds into the present. When enough people can say something is true, and convince enough people that it is true, well, then it becomes true. Mm-hmm. And it is our job sometimes to say, no, it's not. It's not your opinion. If you tell me that it's Sunday, that's not an opinion, that's wrong. Mm-hmm. It's Thursday, right? Mm-hmm. I know it's not Sunday.
All the days run together, you know.
And so then the last step is the firing on Fort Sumter and the bloodless beginning to the war and the romance of, you know, we'd have a few battles and we'd go home because if
there'd even be battles.
And which is such a naive point because I think even a lot of people at that stage thought, well, we'll just settle our differences and then we'll go back to the way that it was, meaning right. slavery won't be touched. Right. Except what we found out is among the common men, once you got them to killing each other, you realize the differences were far greater mm-hmm. than perhaps even what the politicians mm-hmm. ever understood. Mm-hmm. and that Northerners and Southerners in many ways really hated each other. And they hated what they had been doing to the country. And they started to kill each other in droves. And I don't say that to be dramatic. It's the truth. Because when we got together at Manassas and Wilson's Creek and then Shiloh in the 7 days, it wasn't Lincoln and Jeff Davis. It wasn't the wealthy out there fighting, was it? It was us. It was the people. And the people had been driven nearly into insanity by these divisions for almost a generation and a half. And so they took out their frustrations and their anger and their fears on each other. And we bludgeoned and bloodied each other over battlefields.
I think you just hit it right there. It's the fears.
The fears, the terrible fears.
Yeah.
And once it started,
there's no way to stop it.
There's no way to stop it.
It has to let itself literally bleed out.
To death. And Lincoln had to make the hardest decisions, I think, there's a handful of presidents who've had to make very difficult decisions. The easiest thing he ever had to do would be to just let the South walk away, and the country that we live in today would not exist. And the world that we live in would have been it would have gone a different course without a United States. We would have been busted up in a bifurcated form of what we are today. And who knows what the future would have been. But it wouldn't be what we are now. Because the other problem is slavery would have existed for who knows how long, decades. Why would technology stop slavery? You just put a slave on a tractor, put him on a combine. I mean, seriously, why would you stop it? We can't stop a cheap labor flow into the country right now. Why would you stop slavery? It's economics, it's money. And part of the slavery issue is also about race. And so by the time the war begins, the 1860 election is now reshaping the course of the war and of the country. And eventually it leads to emancipation. But I think the last place maybe to finish is the 1864 election.
Yeah.
And what does the incumbent president do to the former general-in-chief of the United States Army?
Beats him in the general election like a redheaded stepchild. Was it 212 electoral votes to 21?
And the soldiers...
76% in favor of Lincoln's reelection.
Exit polling shows it was close to 80%, because many of those soldiers looked at George McClellan and were nauseated.
Yeah.
Asking, what have we been fighting for 3.5 years if he's going to allow these southern states to walk away and slavery to be reinstated in the areas that we have fought to free, like Tennessee, like Arkansas, like New Orleans?
I have, there's a letter from a soldier from...
West Virginia is already a state. What happens? Does McClellan force them back into Virginia?
Mid-sentence, didn't matter.
It's a good point.
It is a good point. But we can look at the soldiers as a great example. Some of the soldiers write letters about Lincoln and McClellan. They write about the election of 1864. I think I've shared this letter with you. There's a man from Illinois, writes about Lincoln's election, writes about McClellan, and he says, we've come so far, we've lost so many, and to vote for McClellan is to betray those who have already died.
It was.
Is to walk away from everything that's just been gone on for the last 2.5, 3 years.
It really was. And that's why he wins. And so he's a 2-term president with a few months to live. And Battle of Franklin, Battle of Nashville, the final few fights in 65, and then the war ends in like some terrible Shakespearean tragedy.
And just in the days before he dies, there's that great moment in Richmond.
Yes.
When he stands in the capital of the Confederacy.
Yeah.
He sits at Davis's desk.
And as he walks through the streets, he's thronged by freed people.
Yeah.
And the people who would say, oh, he didn't care about slavery, will tell that to the people that he helped to free. It didn't, the legal technicalities of the emancipation or his statements of being unsure about a black person's legal equality didn't matter to them. Freedom was a first step. And there is something, I think, profound about someone who is willing to take that hard stand and even questioning his own ideas and thoughts. To me, the 1860 election is really, and the 64 election and the end of the war, is the culmination of the founding of this country. Abraham Lincoln is as close to one of our founders as anyone not born in that era. He was just born years later. Because like Jefferson and many of the slave-owning founders, they were very they were very conflicted. So was Lincoln, but they had a sense of what the country could be. And it couldn't be anything if it just busted up into a bunch of disparate little factions and tribes, and that if we continued to enslave people, which was anathema to the founding to begin with, we had to eradicate that. And I pointed out to a group the other day, when it was all over, there's been one constitutional right that's been removed from our Constitution since the founding. It's the right to own human beings. That's it. The First Amendment was there after the Civil War. The Second Amendment, nobody's guns were taken away. The right to a jury trial, all that. We've had various amendments since. The only right that was taken away was the right to own human beings. And I don't know how anyone could ever argue against that.
And two great rights were given to people. Black suffrage and then citizenship and equal protection under the law.
Right, and then eventually that leads to women's rights to vote, which is, years too late.
And you can look at the 14th Amendment for just about anything that's been litigated in the last 100 years.
And I think the 1860 election also comes down to this. It's a little bit of it may sound sophomoric, but if you could pull a person like Lincoln or even Jefferson or Washington out of a time warp, and there should never be such thing, because I don't think anybody could actually adjust to 250 years of time travel. You would be so shocked. You'd be like, football, what's that? I've never heard of this thing. Or
and then
telephone.
they just explode.
What's this? To be looking at a microphone like, do you pour something in that? If you gave them time, I think many of those people could...
I'm sorry, I'm just watching Abraham Lincoln walk around Times Square.
Yeah, right. He'd be like, wow, the buildings are so tall. They could adjust. Virginia's still there. Illinois is still there. Yeah. The Constitution still exists. Yeah. The country, the society looks different. We dress differently. We're many different colors, very different than we were then. But I think some people, if you pulled them out of a time warp, they would be absolutely disgusted and repulsed by what the country has become. And I won't name any names, but the past is littered with them. And I think that people like Lincoln were thinking about the future, because one of the greatest forms of leadership is not to think just about your time and yourself. It's to think about the people who aren't even born yet, to think about posterity, to think about 20 and 30 and 50 and 100 years from now. Lincoln once said, the emancipation is for the millions who are not yet born. That's a profound way to look at what you are going through, even as hundreds of thousands are dying, but this is the cost that we had to all pay, North and South, white and black, to emerge into a new future. And that's really what the 1860 election was about. It had to happen. And then we had to fight a war. So with that, any last comments about Mr. Lincoln in the 1860 election?
I want to go back to something you said in the very beginning, which is the idea that people will walk around today and say things like, we're so divided. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just given you the perfect example of what an actual divided nation looked like. I'm not an optimist. You tell me all the time, Joseph, you're the most negative person I know. You are Mr. Glass Half Empty. It's empty, okay? I look for the bad in things. All I see is good. And I see good people who have been pushed into this idea, this thinking that somehow my neighbor is my enemy, my friends, I can't be friends with them anymore because they have a different political belief than I do. And that's just nonsense. And the people in 1860, the nation that emerged from the American Civil War, we owe it, I think, to that generation and to the people who have laid their lives down for this country since, to be decent to one another and to have some decency, to understand that we're not as divided as people would like to make us out to be. Lincoln and so many million men gave their lives, or so many thousands of men gave their lives to save the country, and I think that's a pretty damn special thing.
I think that's an important point to end on, and I think that something has happened to
Every
us.
now and then I get one right.
I think in very recent times we have been told over and over again that the country's going to hell, and not just by one person, but by several. And if you look across this great country,
there are people flocking to come here, risking their lives, dying, trying to get here.
But what we are doing right now, baseball, football, buying, selling, marrying, dying,
Having kids.
starting a new business. You can travel here, you can go there.
Yep.
The country is in relative peace. Yes, there's always problems.
Yep.
But we have been led to think that the glass really is half empty or almost empty, and I just reject that because I think a lot of the people from the 1850s and 1860s would look at us and say, like my grandfather used to do with me, "Oh, you're so spoiled. You don't have any idea how good you have it."
Yeah.
And maybe we should reflect on the better angels of our nature, which allows us sometimes to reject the negativity that often permeates us. Lincoln was always aspiring for a better day and a better future and a country that stayed united. So with that, thank you, everybody. It's been a great night of Chalkboard history.